My younger sister Amelia looked flawless in her wedding dress. Ivory silk, delicate embroidery, and the kind of confidence only a 24-year-old bride could wear so effortlessly. I watched her from table 11, the overflow section. The place where distant relatives and forgotten names were quietly parked, close enough to hear the music, far enough to remind you that you didn't quite belong. The venue itself was breathtaking. The Belmont Grand Hall in downtown Seattle shimmered under crystal chandeliers. Polished stone floors reflected soft golden light, and massive glass windows framed the skyline like a painting. Everything about the room whispered money, legacy, and new beginnings. Everything except me. I had dropped my 6-year-old son, Noah, at my neighbor Maya's apartment 3 hours earlier. His disappointed expression still sat heavy in my chest. He'd wanted to come, to wear his little gray suit, to watch Aunt Amelia get married. But weddings like this didn't welcome children, or single mothers who made people uncomfortable. The judgment started the moment I walked in alone. 29 years old. Divorced. 1 child. Wearing a navy blue dress I'd bought years ago and prayed no one remembered. My cousin Rebecca glided past me during the greeting line, glowing in a custom maternity gown that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her hand rested proudly on her rounded belly. Her husband followed just behind her. My ex-husband. Ethan didn't stop. Didn't smile. He gave me a nod so brief it barely counted as acknowledgement, the kind reserved for strangers you regret recognizing. Ethan. The man who left when I told him I was pregnant. The man who married my cousin 8 months later. The man now laughing freely across the ballroom like he'd never destroyed anything in his life. Meanwhile, I worked 12-hour shifts at Harborview Children's Medical Center, came home exhausted, and answered my son's questions about why other kids had dads who showed up. Lena, sweetheart, you came alone? My mother appeared beside the table during cocktail hour, concern and disappointment perfectly blended in her tone. My father stood slightly behind her, avoiding eye contact. We thought you might bring someone, she continued. There are very respectable men here tonight. The Caruso family owns half the waterfront restaurants. I'm fine, Mom, I said, forcing a smile. Noah sends his love. Oh. Yes. The child. The pause said everything. Maya is watching him, I assume? Such a shame you still can't afford proper childcare. They moved on before I could respond. Dinner dragged on endlessly. 7 courses I barely tasted while conversations around me revolved around vacation homes, stock portfolios, and private schools. Then the dancing began. Amelia floated across the floor in her husband's arms. Parents followed. Couples paired off under warm lights. Even distant relatives laughed and spun freely. Outside, clouds rolled in unexpectedly. Rain streaked down the windows, blurring the city lights into soft chaos. That's when I heard his voice. May I have this dance? I turned. Ethan stood behind me, alone. No, I said calmly. Come on, Lena. Just one. We can be adults. I am being an adult. I'm saying no. He leaned closer. You know, it didn't have to end like it did. I stood. Go back to your wife. He smirked. My wife who's carrying my real family. The words hit exactly where he intended. I watched him walk away, watched Rebecca place a hand on her stomach and smile at me from across the room, victorious. The music slowed. Couples filled the floor. I sat back down at table 11 and focused on not crying in front of 200 people who already pitied me. When I noticed him. He stood near the bar, separate from the crowd, yet somehow commanding the room anyway. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Dark hair cut clean. A tailored black suit that screamed quiet power, but it was his eyes that caught me. Sharp. Intent. Watching me like he already knew my story. When our gazes met, I looked away first. Moments later, he was walking toward me. He stopped at my table like he'd planned it all along. Up close, he was even more imposing. At least 6'3". Broad shoulders. The kind of posture that suggested authority without arrogance. His suit fit him perfectly, not flashy, not loud, just expensive in a way you couldn't fake. His eyes were light brown, almost amber under the chandelier glow. Calm. Assessing, there was a faint scar along his jawline, barely noticeable unless you were looking closely. And for some reason, he was looking very closely at me. "You've been alone all night," he said. His voice was low, controlled, with a subtle accent I couldn't quite place. "European, maybe. That seems like a waste." "I'm doing just fine," I replied, even though my pulse had picked up. "But thank you." He didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down as if he belonged there. "I don't think you're fine," he said calmly. "I think you're pretending." I frowned. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough." His gaze didn't waver. "You came to a family wedding alone. A man approached you earlier and said something cruel. You've checked your phone 5 times in 10 minutes. And you're calculating how soon you can leave without drawing attention." My throat tightened. "Am I wrong?" he asked. I exhaled slowly. "You're very observant." "It's a habit." He extended his hand. "Alexander Russo." I hesitated, then shook it. His grip was warm, firm, confident. "Lena Moore." "Lena," he repeated, like he was testing the sound of it. "Bride's sister." Table 11. Overflow section, I corrected. A faint smile touched his mouth. "Still doesn't suit you. Are you a friend of the family?" I asked. "No. Business associate." He gestured vaguely toward the far end of the room. "The Carussos invited me." Of course they did. Alexander leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear him over the music. "I have a proposal for you." I almost laughed. "That makes 2 of us tonight." "Mine is simpler." His eyes flicked briefly toward the dance floor, toward Ethan. "Dance with me. Pretend you're my wife." I stared at him. "Excuse me?" "Just for the evening," he continued evenly. "Let them think you didn't come alone. Let them stop looking at you like a problem that needs fixing." "That's insane," I said. "Possibly." He stood and offered his hand. "But the next song is starting. And your ex-husband is watching us like he just realized he made a mistake." I followed his gaze. Ethan was staring. Hard. Alexander's voice dropped. "So what do you say, Lena?" "One dance. Let them believe you belong to someone who actually chooses you." Every rational part of my brain screamed no. I took his hand. "One dance," I said. "That's it." His smile was slow. Devastating. "We'll see." He guided me onto the dance floor with practiced ease. His hand settled at my lower back, firm but respectful, while his other hand held mine gently. He danced like someone who knew how to lead. Confident. Controlled. "My mother insisted on lessons," he said quietly. "She believed a man should never leave a woman guessing." "That's rare," I admitted. "She was very specific." Something shadowed his expression. "She passed away 2 years ago." "I'm sorry." "She would have liked you," he said without hesitation. "She admired women who survived without becoming bitter." I laughed softly. "You don't know me well enough to say that." "I know strength when I see it." The song ended. Another began, slower, more intimate. I became aware of eyes on us. My mother. My sister. Cousins whispering, Ethan standing frozen near the bar. Alexander followed my gaze. "He's angry. He doesn't get to be." "No," Alexander agreed. "He doesn't." When the music finally faded, he offered his arm. "Shall we return to your table?" I suspect your family has questions. They did. The moment we sat down, my aunt swooped in. Lena. You didn't tell us you brought someone. This is Alexander Russo, I said. Alexander, my Aunt Margaret. Pleasure, he replied smoothly. Your family hosts beautiful weddings. And how long have you two been together? She asked. Several months, Alexander answered without missing a beat. Quietly. Lena prefers privacy. His arm rested behind my chair, protective. Intentional. My aunt blinked. Oh. Well. That's wonderful. I looked up at him. You're very good at this. At improvising, he murmured. Necessary skill. And what exactly do you do, Alexander? Import. Export. His thumb brushed lightly against my knuckles under the table. Among other things. Before I could press further, a familiar voice cut in. Lena. Ethan stood beside the table. We need to talk. Alexander rose instantly, his presence shifting. I don't think that's necessary. Ethan scoffed. This is between me and my ex-wife. Alexander's gaze hardened. She isn't alone anymore. The room felt suddenly smaller. I'll drive Lena home, Alexander continued calmly. The storm is getting worse. It wasn't a request. Ethan hesitated, then stepped back. I looked up at Alexander. You don't have to. I know, he said quietly. But I want to. The rain was coming down hard by the time we reached the entrance. A sleek black SUV waited at the curb, engine idling, headlights cutting through the downpour. A driver stood beside it, holding the door open like this was routine. I stopped short. You have a driver? I asked. Alexander glanced back at me. I prefer not to drive in storms. That was an understatement. He opened the back door and waited until I was seated before sliding in beside me. The door closed, sealing us into leather, quiet, and a faint scent of cedar and something darker. Home, the driver asked. Alexander gave my address before I could say a word. I looked at him. How did you? Your aunt mentioned it earlier, he said smoothly. Near the park. 3rd floor walk up. The car pulled into traffic, rain streaking across the windows, blurring the city into motion and light. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Thank you, I finally said. For tonight. It wasn't charity, Alexander replied. It was mutual. Was it? I asked. Because you stepped into a family war you didn't create. I don't step into anything accidentally. His tone wasn't arrogant, just factual. I studied his profile. Calm. Controlled. Too controlled. So what do you actually want? I asked. He turned to me. The same thing you do. A little peace. His hand found mine between us, warm, grounding. I didn't pull away. My family won't stop asking questions now, I said quietly. Neither will mine, he replied. Which is why I'm going to suggest something you won't like. I stiffened. Go on. Continue the lie, he said. For a few weeks. I let out a breath. Absolutely not. Public appearances only. Dinners. Family gatherings. Enough to quiet speculation. And then what? Then we part ways politely. His thumb brushed my knuckles. No damage. No emotions? I challenged. He met my eyes. That's the rule. The SUV slowed to a stop in front of my building. Think about it, he said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a black business card embossed with silver lettering. Call me if you decide peace is worth pretending. He walked me to the door despite the rain, waited until I was safely inside, then disappeared back into the night. I stood in the hallway long after the sound of the engine faded, should have thrown the card away. I didn't. Monday morning arrived too quickly. I woke before my alarm, mind replaying the wedding, the dance, the way Alexander's presence had shifted everything. Noah was already awake, building a crooked tower of blocks on the living room floor. Morning, Mama, he said. Did the wedding have cake? It did, I smiled. You didn't miss much. I dropped him off at school and rushed to work, the familiar chaos of Harborview wrapping around me like armor. By noon, my phone was vibrating non-stop of family. Cousins. Even my mother. Who is Alexander? Why didn't you tell us? Are you serious about him? I ignored all of it. Until I couldn't. When I stepped out of a patient room, I nearly collided with Ethan in the hallway. What are you doing here? I hissed. I need answers, he snapped. Who is that man, Lena? Not your business. I checked, he said. No one knows him. No hospital connections. No background. Nothing. My stomach tightened. That's because he's not part of your world, I said. Now leave. Is he paying you? Ethan asked. The words felt like a slap. I stared at him. Get out. Because that would make sense, he continued bitterly. You need help. He has money. It's an arrangement. Security arrived before I could respond. Ethan left, furious. I spent the rest of the shift shaking. That evening, Maya came over with takeout and questions. You're trending in the family group chat, she said flatly. So start talking. I told her everything. She stared at me. This is a terrible idea. I know. And you're going to do it anyway. Yes. She sighed. Promise me you'll be careful. I promise. That was a lie. At 10:30, someone knocked on my door. Hard. I checked the peephole. 2 men stood in the hallway. Dark coats. Sharp eyes. One had a tattoo climbing up his neck. Lena Moore, the taller one, asked. I don't know you. We know who you know, he said calmly. Alexander Russo. My blood went cold. We saw the wedding photos, the second man added, holding up his phone. A picture of Alexander and me mid-dance. Close. Intimate. That makes you interesting. I'm calling the police, I said, fingers tightening around my phone. The taller man smiled. Do that. We'll be gone before they arrive. But we'll be back. They left. I locked the door, heart pounding. Hands shaking, I pulled out the business card. And dialed. He answered immediately. Lena. 2 men just came to my apartment, I said. They had photos. They know your name. Silence. Then, lock your door. I'm on my way. The line went dead. I looked down the hallway toward my son's room. And realized, with terrifying clarity, that this had never just been a lie. Alexander arrived in less than 12 minutes. I knew it because I was counting my breaths. The knock this time was different, controlled, deliberate. I opened the door and he was there, rain-soaked coat discarded, jaw tight, eyes no longer calm. Behind him stood 2 men. Taller. Broader. Professional in the way they scanned the hallway, the stairwell, every shadow. Are you hurt? Alexander asked immediately. No, I whispered. But Noah. He was already moving past me. He checked the locks, the windows, the fire escape. One of the men quietly walked down the hallway toward my son's room and returned moments later with a nod. Child's asleep, he said. Alexander exhaled once, slow, controlled, then turned back to me. Tell me exactly what they said. I did. His expression didn't change, but the air in the room did. He took out his phone, typed a single message, and sent it. Within seconds, his phone buzzed. Good, he said softly. They were sloppy. That's not comforting, I replied. It should be, he said. It means they weren't sent by someone serious. I stared at him. Alexander, who are these people? He met my gaze fully for the first time that night. People who don't belong anywhere near you. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. But it's the safest one for now. For now? My voice broke. They mentioned photos. They knew my address. My son, I know. His voice sharpened. And that's why this stops tonight. He turned to the men behind him. Clear the perimeter. Stay within sight. They nodded and stepped outside without a word. I folded my arms, trying to keep myself together. You told me this would be harmless. I told you I would keep you safe, he corrected. And I will. That assumes I trust you. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You called me. I had no response. Pack a bag, he said gently. For you and Noah. No, I said instantly. I'm not running. You're not, he replied. You're relocating. Temporarily. I'm not bringing my son into whatever this is. You already did, he said quietly. When they knocked on your door. The truth of it hit harder than fear. He knelt slightly to my eye level. Listen to me, Lena. I don't involve civilians. I don't blur lines. And I especially don't endanger children. What are you, then? I asked. A businessman? A fixer? A criminal? He considered me for a long moment. I manage problems, he said. At a level most people never see. That sounds like a threat. It's a promise. I looked toward Noah's room again. He slept peacefully, unaware his world had shifted. How long? I asked. A few days, Alexander said. Until I know who leaked those photos. And after that? After that, he said carefully, you decide whether you want to keep pretending or hear the full truth. The safe house didn't look like a safe house. It looked like a luxury apartment overlooking the water. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Neutral tones. Security so subtle you felt it more than you saw it. Noah woke briefly during the drive but fell back asleep in Alexander's arms, something that startled me more than everything else. He doesn't like strangers, I murmured. He knows I won't drop him, Alexander said simply. Inside, a woman introduced herself as Clara and brought warm milk, fresh sheets, and reassurance without questions. Stay here, Alexander told me quietly. I need to finish something. Finish what? Making sure they don't come back. He paused at the door. Lena. I am sorry. For what? For meeting you at the wrong moment in your life. The door closed behind him. I stood by the window long after, watching the city lights ripple across dark water. At 2:17 a.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Your ex-husband has been asking the wrong questions, another message followed. I've handled it. I stared at the screen, heart racing. What does that mean? I typed. The reply came seconds later. It means he won't bother you again. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the apartment felt amplified, the soft hum of the climate system, the distant rush of traffic below, the quiet rhythm of Noah's breathing from the bedroom down the hall. At dawn, I finally gave up and stood by the window. The city looked calm. Innocent. As if nothing dark ever moved beneath its surface. My phone buzzed again at 6:04 a.m. Alexander. Good morning. Did you and Noah sleep at all? Barely, I typed back. You said you handled it. I need to know what that means. There was a pause. Then. I'm coming up. A minute later, the elevator chimed. Alexander stepped inside looking untouched by the night, crisp shirt, dark coat, no visible fatigue. But something in his eyes had changed. He looked settled. Coffee? I asked automatically. Yes, he said. Black. We sat at the kitchen island while the sun slowly climbed over the water. You spoke to Ethan, I said. I spoke to someone on his behalf. My hands tightened around the mug. Is he hurt? No, Alexander replied. But he's frightened. And that's sufficient. That's not reassuring. It's honest. He leaned back slightly. Your ex-husband has been attempting to access information about me. Through contacts he shouldn't have. That sounds dangerous. It is, Alexander said calmly. For him. I stared at him. You're not just an importer. No. And you don't just manage problems. No. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he said, there are organizations that move money, goods, influence, quietly. Across borders. Across governments. They require structure. Discipline. Enforcement. My pulse quickened. I oversee one of them. I swallowed. You're describing a criminal syndicate. I'm describing a reality, he corrected. The word you're looking for depends on who's asking. You're a crime boss. His mouth curved slightly. Not amused. Not offended. Yes. The word landed with terrifying weight. I stood abruptly. Then we're done. This ends now. Sit down, he said, not commanding, but certain. I will not raise my son anywhere near this. You won't, he said firmly. That is non-negotiable. Then why bring us here at all? Because you were already in danger, he replied. And because I don't abandon people I've claimed responsibility for. I never agreed to that. No, he said softly. You didn't. I did. I laughed bitterly. You don't get to decide that for me. You're right, he said. Which is why you'll leave once this is finished. Finished how? When the message is clear, he replied. You are untouchable. I shook my head. You say that like it's a status. It is. The elevator chimed again. Two men entered, one I recognized from the night before, and another older man with silver hair and sharp eyes. Boss, the older man said. It's handled. Alexander nodded. Details. Photos traced to a private investigator hired through a shell account. Funded by your ex-husband's wife's family. My stomach dropped. Rebecca? Yes, the man confirmed. She believed exposing you would destabilize Ethan's career if your association continued. So she sent people to my home? My voice trembled. She outsourced curiosity, Alexander said coldly. That was her mistake. What happens to her? I asked. Nothing illegal, he replied. Her family contracts were frozen. Her husband resigned from his firm this morning. Quietly. I sank back into the chair. Alexander dismissed the men, then turned back to me. This is the part where you decide, he said. You can walk away after today. I will make sure no one follows. And if I don't? Then we stop pretending, he said. And I protect you openly. That sounds worse. It is, he admitted. But it's honest. Noah padded into the kitchen then, rubbing his eyes. Mama? I scooped him up instinctively. Alexander watched us, something unreadable crossing his face. He's safe, he said quietly. With or without me. I met his gaze. You don't scare me because you're powerful. What scares you, then? That part of me trusts you, I whispered. He nodded once. That's the most dangerous part. I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I held Noah a little tighter and felt his breathing slow again as he drifted back toward sleep. This wasn't about Alexander. It never had been. It was about what kind of life my son would wake up to tomorrow. I'm not staying because I trust you, I said finally. I'm staying because I don't have the luxury of pretending danger disappears when I walk away. Alexander didn't interrupt. I will not live in fear, I continued. And I will not let my son become leverage. If I stay, it's on my terms. He inclined his head. Name them. First, I said, steadying my voice, Noah is never discussed in your world. Not as family. Not as weakness. Not as insurance. Agreed, Alexander said instantly. He doesn't exist to them. Second, I went on, I don't lie to him. I don't disappear without explanation. Whatever story we tell the outside world, it will never make him feel unsafe. You have my word. Third, I said, meeting his eyes, you don't control my life. You don't decide where I go, who I see, or what I become. A pause, then he said, I will advise. I will warn. But I won't command. And if I ignore your advice? He almost smiled. Then I adapt. Fourth, I said quietly, this ends if my son is ever threatened. Not negotiated. Not justified. Ends. Alexander stood. He took a single step closer and lowered himself slightly so we were eye to eye. If that line is crossed, he said evenly, there will be nothing left of the world that allowed it. The promise chilled me more than any threat could have. Last, I said. This is not ownership. I am not yours. He considered that for longer than anything else. Finally, you are with me because you choose to be. Every day. I exhaled. Then we have an agreement, I said. He extended his hand. I didn't take it. Instead, I said, and you don't get to fall in love with me. That earned a real reaction, brief, sharp surprise. I don't fall in love, he replied. Good, I said. Neither do I. A lie. We both knew it. The arrangement changed everything. Publicly, Alexander Russo became my partner. Privately, boundaries were drawn in ink, not sand. I returned to work under increased security I was not supposed to notice. Noah's school changed quietly, better teachers, tighter gates, no explanation. My family stopped asking questions. Rebecca stopped calling. Ethan vanished from my life completely. At first, I told myself this was survival. But survival has a way of becoming normal, and normal has a way of becoming dangerous. 2 weeks later, Alexander invited me to dinner. Not at a restaurant. At a private residence overlooking the harbor, glass, steel, and silence. This isn't a date, I said as we walked in. No, he agreed. It's a test. Of what? Of whether you can sit at a table where people lie for a living. Inside, 5 men waited. They rose when Alexander entered. One of them studied me openly. This is her? Yes, Alexander said. This is Lena. Nothing else. No title. No explanation. That was worse. Dinner was polite. Controlled. Dangerous beneath the surface, they discussed logistics disguised as philanthropy. Donations that weren't donations. Projects that weren't projects. I listened. I learned. And I spoke only when necessary. When the meal ended, one man finally asked, how long will she stay? Alexander didn't look at me when he answered, as long as she chooses. Silence followed. Respect earned. As we left, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't drowning. I was adapting. And somewhere between survival and strategy, a line had shifted. The first sign that things were changing came quietly. Too quietly. Alexander had always moved with certainty, plans layered on plans, contingencies prepared long before problems surfaced. But that morning, as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows reviewing messages on his phone, something in his posture was off. Tense. Calculating. Something happened, I said. He didn't look up. Something is about to happen. I crossed my arms. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you right now. I studied him. You said I wouldn't be kept in the dark. I said I wouldn't lie, he corrected. There's a difference. I waited. Finally, he set the phone down. Someone is challenging my territory. Quietly. Intelligently. Who? A group out of Vancouver, he replied. They move through tech companies, logistics firms, medical suppliers. I froze. Medical? Yes. A chill ran through me. That's my world. And that, Alexander said, meeting my gaze, is why you're sitting here instead of being sent away. I didn't like that answer, but I understood it. The next few days felt like chess played at human speed. Meetings that looked like charity luncheons. Phone calls disguised as investor updates. Invitations that were really surveillance. I started noticing patterns. Who arrived late? Who avoided eye contact? Who spoke too carefully? At one dinner, a man named Victor Hale smiled too much and asked too many questions about hospital supply chains, caught Alexander watching me as I listened. You see it, he said later, when we were alone. They're probing, I replied. Not you. Me. Yes. And you let them. I needed to know how far they'd go. That's dangerous, I said sharply. So is underestimating you, he replied. The breaking point came 3 nights later. Noah was asleep. The apartment was quiet. Alexander took a call on the balcony. When he came back inside, his face was unreadable. They approached you directly, he said. I nodded. Victor Hale called my office. Claimed to represent a startup looking for distribution partnerships. And he wanted me to introduce him to procurement contacts. Alexander's jaw tightened. You didn't. No, I said. But I didn't shut him down either. Silence. You're angry, I said. I'm assessing, he replied. You stepped into active play without clearance. I met his eyes. I stepped into reality. They already see me as a doorway. Pretending otherwise won't close it. That doorway leads to war. Then stop treating me like something fragile that needs guarding, I said. Use me. The words hung between us. Slowly, something dark and impressed crossed his expression. You're asking to become visible, he said. I already am, I replied. The difference is whether I'm bait or a player. The next day, Alexander did something no one expected, brought me to a meeting he'd never allowed an outsider to attend. A warehouse by the docks. Empty except for a long table and 6 men who fell silent the moment we entered. This is Lena, Alexander said. She will be joining today's discussion. Murmurs followed. One man scoffed. She's not from our world. No, Alexander agreed. She's from the one they're trying to steal. That shut them up. The discussion turned technical, shipping routes, hospital tenders, shell companies. I spoke twice. Both times, the room shifted. You're thinking like they do, one man said slowly. I have to, I replied. They hide behind compliance and paperwork. That's their weapon. Alexander watched me like he was seeing me for the first time. When the meeting ended, he pulled me aside. You just changed the board, he said quietly. Good, I answered. Because they're already making their next move. That night, I found Alexander alone in his office. Lights low. Whiskey untouched. This was never the plan, he said without turning. Plans evolve. He looked at me then. You're becoming indispensable. That scares you. Yes, he admitted. And you're starting to trust me, I added. That scares me more. I stepped closer. You said I could choose every day. I did. Then today, I said softly, I choose not to be protected. I choose to stand beside you. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, if you do this, there's no stepping back. I know. He reached for my hand, not possessive, not cautious. Certain. Somewhere across the city, Victor Hale made a phone call, and the game shifted from observation to confrontation. The first strike didn't come with guns or blood. It came with paperwork. At 8:12 a.m., my hospital email filled with alerts, audits, compliance reviews, procurement freezes. All routine on the surface. All devastating beneath it. By 9 o'clock, 3 suppliers had suspended deliveries. By 10:30, the board wanted answers. They're choking the system, I said into the phone as I paced Alexander's office. Slowly. Legally. I know, he replied. They're forcing you to make mistakes. They won't get one, I said. But they want to see how you react. Yes, Alexander said quietly. This is a message. We can touch her. I hung up and stared out at the harbor, jaw tight. This wasn't just business. This was personal. By noon, Victor Hale's name appeared on my caller ID. I let it ring once. Twice. Then I answered. Lena, he said warmly. Rough morning? You're bold, I replied. Calling me directly. Transparent, he corrected. We prefer clean lines. You froze pediatric supply chains, I said flatly. That's not clean. A temporary inconvenience, he said smoothly. One that disappears if the right introductions are made. I smiled despite myself. You misjudged me, I said. I don't trade children's lives for leverage. A pause. Then, Alexander Russo does. The line went dead. That evening, Alexander came home with blood on his cuff. Not much. Just enough. I stood when I saw it. What happened? An overconfident courier, he said. Nothing serious. I reached for his wrist before I realized I was doing it. He froze. Not from pain. From the contact. You told me you'd keep this away from me, I said quietly. I tried, he replied. They escalated. So will we, I said. His eyes darkened. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment they used my hospital as a weapon. Silence. Then he said, they're testing boundaries. So are you, I answered. You're deciding whether I'm a partner or a liability. That's not fair. No, I agreed. But it's true. That night, the attack came closer, too close. At 2:41 a.m., the building's security alarms tripped. Alexander was on his feet instantly, gun in hand, already moving. I followed despite his sharp, stay back. From the hallway camera feed, we saw it, a fire alarm sabotage. Meant to force evacuation. Meant to create chaos, they're watching response time, I said. Mapping behavior. You're thinking like them again, Alexander muttered. Then listen, I said. This wasn't about hurting us. It was about seeing if you'd pull me out of the game. He looked at me sharply. They want to know if I'm your weakness, I continued. Or your shield. And what are you, he asked. I stepped closer, heart pounding. That depends on whether you let me finish what I started. He searched my face. For fear. For hesitation. He didn't find it. Fine, he said finally. We do this together. The words felt heavier than any promise we'd made before. Later, when the building was secured and Noah slept peacefully through it all, Alexander poured 2 drinks. He handed one to me. I don't usually share command, he said. I don't usually ask for it, I replied. We stood there, close enough that the air between us felt charged. You could still walk away, he said. Take your son. Start over. I met his gaze. You already know I won't. Yes, he said softly. That's what terrifies me. I reached up and wiped the blood from his cuff. Slowly. Deliberately. His breath changed. This is a bad idea, he murmured. I know. He didn't stop me, and that was the moment everything truly crossed the line. Across the city, Victor Hale watched security footage on a silent screen. She didn't break, someone said beside him. Victor smiled thinly. No, he replied. She chose a side. He leaned forward. Prepare phase 2. The line didn't break all at once, it bent. After the alarms were reset and the security teams cleared out, the apartment felt unnaturally quiet. Too still. Like the calm that follows impact. Alexander stood at the window, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and lethal. Double the rotation. I want eyes on every access point, he said. No exceptions. He ended the call and finally turned toward me. You should rest. So should you. He almost smiled. Instead, he poured another drink and set it aside, untouched. You were right, he said. They're not testing me anymore. They're testing us. I nodded. Victor Hale doesn't want territory. He wants legitimacy. Access to medical supply routes gives him cover. And you're the key, Alexander added. That makes you the target. Then we change the narrative, I said. We make him visible. He studied me. You're proposing exposure. Strategic exposure, I corrected. He operates in gray zones. Drag him into light, he'll overcorrect. And you'll be standing in that light, he said sharply. I already am. The next day, I did something reckless. I went to work as usual. No escort. No altered schedule. By noon, the rumor mill was spinning. By 3, Victor Hale requested a meeting openly, through legal channels. They're confident, Alexander said over the phone. That makes them sloppy. They think I'm scared, I replied. I'm not. You're furious. Yes. He exhaled. Meet him. But not alone. The restaurant overlooked the bay, glass walls, polite music, and the illusion of safety. Victor arrived early. Tall. Well-dressed. Smiling like a man who believed the outcome was already decided. Lena, he said warmly, rising. I was hoping you'd accept. I shook his hand. I prefer clarity. He laughed. So do I. We sat. I'll be direct, he said. Your association with Alexander Russo complicates things. That's not my problem, I replied. It could be, he said calmly. Hospitals depend on uninterrupted supply chains. I can stabilize those. In exchange? Introductions. Access. Discretion. I leaned back. And if I refuse? His smile thinned. Then we continue what we started. I met his gaze. You're not as careful as you think. His eyes flickered, just slightly. You made a mistake using audits, I continued. It left a paper trail. One I've already flagged. Silence. You won't expose me, he said finally. It would destroy you too. That's where you're wrong, I said. I don't need to expose everything. Just enough. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced down. Color drained from his face. What did you do? He demanded. I chose transparency, I said. Something you don't survive. That night, Alexander didn't touch me. He stood in the doorway of my room like a man at war with himself. You endangered yourself today, he said. So did you, I replied. Every day before you met me. This isn't the same. No, I agreed. This is worse. Because now you care. The word hung heavy between us. You said you don't fall in love, I said softly. I don't, he replied. A beat. Which means if this ends, he continued, voice low, it ends badly. I stepped closer. Then don't let it end yet. His restraint snapped. Not violently. Decisively. He kissed me like a man who knew exactly what he was risking, and chose it anyway. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine. This changes nothing, he said. I smiled faintly. It changes everything. Across town, Victor Hale watched his network unravel in real time. Phones went unanswered. Accounts froze. Meetings cancelled. This isn't possible, he muttered. A message appeared on his screen. Unknown sender. You should have stayed invisible. Victor swallowed. The war was no longer theoretical. It had begun. War doesn't announce itself with noise. It begins with silence. The morning after Victor Hale's network started collapsing, the city felt unchanged. Traffic moved. Coffee shops opened. Children went to school, but beneath it all, lines were being redrawn. Alexander stood at the center of it. His office became command, not comfort. Screens glowed with data streams I wasn't meant to fully understand. Names, routes, timestamps. Decisions made in seconds that would echo for years. You should take Noah out of the city, he said without looking up. I didn't answer immediately. I won't argue with you, he added. I'll just make it happen if I have to. That made me turn. You promised, I said quietly. No commands. I promised to adapt, he replied. And this is me adapting. And what happens when they realize I'm gone? I asked. They'll know I matter. He looked at me then. Really looked. You matter whether you stay or go, he said. That's the problem. The attack came that afternoon. Not at us. At the hospital. A delivery truck rerouted. A refrigeration unit sabotaged. Critical pediatric medication delayed just long enough to trigger panic. I was in the middle of it when my phone rang. Get out, Alexander said the second I answered. Now. I can't, I said. Not yet. Lena. Listen to me, I cut in. This is what they want. If I disappear, they win the narrative. Silence. Then, tightly, you have 10 minutes. I coordinated damage control like my life depended on it, because it did. By the time I stepped outside, security was already moving in ways that didn't belong to a hospital. Black cars. Familiar faces. Alexander stood by the curb, fury barely contained beneath control. You almost died, he said. No, I replied. I almost let them define me. He grabbed my wrist, not to restrain, but to reassure himself I was real. Don't do that again, he said. I will, I answered. Because now they know I won't run. That night, the counterstrike began. Quiet seizures. Contracts revoked. Allies pressured. Victor Hale went from hunter to hunted in less than 12 hours, and then he did something desperate. He leaked my name. Not to the police. To the press. By morning, articles were circulating. Hospital administrator linked to international smuggling figure. Questions raised about ethics and influence. I stared at the screen, numb. This is my fault, Alexander said flatly. No, I replied. This was always coming. You can still leave, he said. I'll erase you from this. And live the rest of my life waiting for the next lie? I asked. No. He stepped closer. They won't stop now. Neither will we. The final move came at midnight. A location ping. A careless call. Victor Hale thought he'd found leverage. He hadn't realized he'd exposed himself. Alexander prepared to go alone. I blocked the door. "You're not doing this without me. This is the endgame," he said. "If it goes wrong." "It already went wrong," I replied. "The moment you met me." He searched my face, then nodded once. "Stay in the car." "I won't." He didn't argue. That scared me more than if he had. The warehouse was dark, empty, waiting. Victor stood in the center, pale but defiant. "You ruined everything," he said when he saw us. "No," Alexander replied calmly. "You overreached." Victor laughed, brittle, broken. "You think you've won?" "I know I have," Alexander said. Victor's eyes flicked to me. "That's your weakness," he sneered. Alexander didn't look at me when he answered. "She's my line." The sound of sirens rose in the distance. Victor's smile faded. "What did you do?" he whispered. "I let the right people see you," I said. The doors burst open. And as chaos erupted, Alexander's hand found mine, firm, grounding. No escape. No retreat. Only consequences. The sirens didn't stop everything, they only changed the rules. Victor Hale was taken away screaming about deals and immunity, his voice swallowed by flashing lights and concrete walls. By sunrise, his name was everywhere: fraud, trafficking, shell companies unraveling in public. To the world, it was justice. To Alexander's world, it was a warning. We returned to the apartment just before dawn. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was heavy with what had been lost. "You crossed a line tonight," Alexander said finally. "So did you," I replied. He nodded. "Yes." That was when I knew. This wasn't over. 3 hours later, the call came. Alexander listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When he ended the call, he leaned back slowly. "They're blaming me," he said. "Not publicly. Internally." I felt cold. "Who is they?" "The council," he replied. "The people who tolerate me because I keep things quiet." And Victor made things very loud. "Yes." "What does that mean?" "It means I need to disappear," he said. "For a while." My chest tightened. Or they remove me. The implication was clear. Permanent. We sat at opposite ends of the table as the sky brightened. "No," I said. "You don't get to vanish and leave me to clean up the fallout." He looked at me carefully. "This isn't a discussion." I stood. "You said I could choose every day." "You chose to stand with me," he said. "Now let me stand alone." "That's not protection," I snapped. "That's control." His jaw tightened. "For the first time since I met you," I continued, "you're underestimating me." Silence. Then he said, "They'll come after anyone still tied to me." "Then cut the tie," I said. "Publicly." He froze. "You take the blame," I went on. "You let them believe I was leverage you eliminated." "That would destroy you," he said sharply. "No," I replied. "It would free me." He stared at me like he was seeing the board for the first time. "You'd become invisible again," he murmured. "And you," I said, "would still be alive." The plan was brutal. Effective. By noon, rumors spread through channels I wasn't supposed to know existed. Alexander Russo had overreached. He'd allowed emotion to compromise judgment. He'd severed the weakness. By evening, he was gone. No goodbye. No explanation. Just absence. The fallout hit fast. Accounts froze. Protection thinned. Eyes watched me to see if I would break. I didn't. I went to work. I stabilized the hospital. I faced the press without flinching. "No personal relationship," I said calmly. No knowledge of illicit activity. The truth. Just not the whole truth. Weeks passed. Then months. The city forgot Alexander Russo. But his world didn't forget me. The first visit came quietly. A man I didn't recognize waited outside my office one evening. "They want to know where you stand," he said simply. "With who?" I asked. "With the future." I smiled faintly. "Tell them I stand with stability." He studied me. Then nodded. After that, the visits continued. Questions. Requests. Tests. I answered carefully. I learned quickly. And one day, I realized something terrifying. They weren't watching me anymore. They were listening. The call came at 2:17 a.m. a number I hadn't seen in months. I answered without speaking. "You did well," Alexander's voice said softly. I closed my eyes. "Where are you?" I asked. "Safe," he replied. "For now." "And the council?" "Divided," he said. "Because of you." I let out a slow breath. "You sacrificed everything." "No," he corrected. "I invested." Silence stretched between us. "I won't come back the same," he said finally. "I wouldn't want you to," I replied. "And you?" he asked. "I'm no longer something they can erase," I said. A pause. Then a low, quiet laugh. "I always knew." Before the line went dead, he added. "When the time comes, they won't be choosing me." I stood by the window long after. The city looked the same. But power had shifted. And this time, it wasn't wearing a suit in the shadows. It was learning how to speak with my voice. Power doesn't return all at once. It seeps back in. Quiet meetings. Unofficial approvals. Doors that open without knocking. By the time winter settled over the city, my name no longer drew curiosity, it drew calculation. Hospitals stabilized. Supply chains normalized. The press moved on, and I remained. Not untouched. Untouchable. I was leaving the office late one evening when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Pier 47. Midnight. No signature. None needed. The pier was empty except for the sound of water against steel. Fog rolled in low and slow, swallowing the city lights behind me. I stopped near the edge, coat pulled tight, pulse steady. "You're late," a voice said behind me. I turned. Alexander stood a few steps back, hands in his pockets, dark coat blending into shadow. He looked leaner. Sharper. Less guarded. "More real." "You're early," I replied. A small smile touched his mouth. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he said, "You changed the board." "So did you," I answered. "I burned my position," he said calmly. "They let me walk because they couldn't agree on what to replace me with." "And now?" "Now," he said, stepping closer, "they don't need me the way they used to." I studied him. "Does that bother you?" "No," he replied. "It frees me." We walked along the pier in silence. "I heard about the hospital expansion," he said. "You did that without favors." "I did it with leverage," I corrected. "There's a difference." He stopped. "You became what they respect." "I became what they can't afford to lose." He nodded. "Exactly." The wind picked up. Cold. Clean. "I didn't come here to restart what we were," he said. "I know," I replied. "I came to see if there's room for something new." I met his gaze. "With rules." "Always," he said. "No ownership," I continued. "No disappearing acts." "And no pretending," he added. "Good." A pause. "And Noah?" he asked quietly. I smiled. He knows you as the man who brings the good apples. Alexander laughed, soft, genuine. I can live with that. We stopped at the end of the pier. City behind us. Water ahead. You know, he said, if I stay near you, they'll watch. They already do, I replied. They just won't interfere. And if I walk away? I'll still be standing, I said. With or without you. He looked at me then, really looked. Not like a boss. Not like a protector. Like an equal. I don't need to lead anymore, he said. I need to choose. I held out my hand. Then choose. He took it. Not tightly. Not possessively. Steady. Some stories end with victory, ours ended with alignment. No crowns. No promises carved in stone. Just two people who survived the dark long enough to decide what came next, together.